Okay, today, Monday, May 18th, 2026. We are rapidly approaching the holiday of Shavuot. And because Shavuot occurs on Shabbat, we won't read Parshat Naso, so we will postpone Parshat Naso for a future class. But I'm sure it won't, disappoint you that we study a text that we don't really get to study often, which is the Book of Ruth. Book of
Oh,
Ruth is read on Shavuot, and uh, there's a text and a subtext in this class today. The text is Ruth. The subtext is Ruth as a book that is a subversive book. That's a good question. Whether or not it's a it's an arguable proposition, and my subtext is now that we are beginning to acquaint ourselves more deeply with the world of artificial intelligence, how does artificial intelligence become a kind of pseudo artificial chavruta partner, a learning partner? And I think I'm past the wow, unbelievable stage, although I still am pretty marveled. I marvel at this. I'm at the stage of if artificial intelligence is your chavruta partner, do you need a chavruta partner? What does that mean? And what I'm going to say is that, and this is a kind of I didn't organize the class along these lines, but the idea that it's a research aid for us in ways that are, I think, unprecedented. And we've talked about it before in terms of, I mean, the time that it saves. So there are things that we get out of it at a certain cost. But what I want to do, um, rather than go into that part of the discussion, I want to start with the a springboard for this, and the springboard is an article that appears on the website, which I've talked about before, called thetorah.com. The Torah.com, I think, is a very, very useful website. I'm just going to bring up the article here, and uh, and it raises a very interesting thesis about the book of Ruth. So here's the article. The article is called Megillat Ruth: When Kindness Conflicts with the Torah. Interesting. So we'll have to begin to project here, uh, just as the operating concept here, kindness, chesed, and Torah being law, the things that that tell us how to live our lives, the rules and statutes, etc. This is written by Rabbi Tamara Cohen Ashkenazi. She is an emeritus professor of Bible. I'll just scoot down and tell you who she is. She do. She is. Did I lose that? Sorry. Am I going to get that again? No, we don't want to see that. Back to this. The Torah. Come.
know where you've been all day anyway.
You showed me, yes, of course. Roots, popular, latest, popular. Ugh. You press the wrong button and it just goes.
Yeah, see, you need a chavruta because we think.
One moment, please. Stop share. Get it up there. Mm, here we go. Back to this. Okay. So Tamara Cohn Ashkenazi, this is who she is. She is the F.E. Wise Ox Professor Emerita of Biblical Literature at Hebrew Union College. Okay, editor of the Torah Women's Commentary. Back to the article. Okay, I'm sorry about that. So, beautiful illustration. And she starts out this article at thetorah.com with the following quote. I'm going to make it larger. Okay. The scroll. What does the book of Ruth teach? Rav Zera famously declared, Megillah zo ein ba lo tuma velo tahara velo isur velo heter lama nichteva lelamedcha kama schar tov legomlei chasidim. The scroll of Ruth tells us nothing either of purity or impurity, of the forbidden or the permitted. For what purpose was it written? To teach how great is the reward of those who do deeds of loving kindness. I'm just going to close that. I put that in a different text here. Here we go. And I'm just going to highlight it in my own way without the article here. We'll go back to the article in a second. But the quote is a lovely quote. It's one of these rabbinic statements that you kind of put out and you really meditate on. And I went in different directions with this, and I'm going to take you on this little voyage here with these different directions. So I'm going to read the quote again and then translate it for you. Amar Rabbi Zera said, Megillah zo, this scroll, ein ba lo tuma, velo tahara, velo isur, velo heter. It does not have in it categories of impurity, purity, that which is forbidden, that was permitted. And let me explain. Those are the classic rabbinic categories that define ritual law. So, you can go, kashrut is a perfect example, right? Rabbinic law deals with what you can and cannot eat. Rabbinic law deals with where you can and cannot go. Rabbinic law, biblical law, rabbinic law, Jewish law, halacha deals with what you can and cannot do on Shabbat, what you can and cannot do on festivals, and all these things that govern our lives, okay? And we could talk endlessly about all the halachot that we do from the moment we wake up to the moment we go to sleep, areas in ritual, areas in the way we conduct our lives, and on and on and on. And so what he's saying is quite interesting, Rabbi Zera. He says the book doesn't deal with any of that. The book only deals with, he's saying, if it's not a book about law, it's not a book that is going to shape our understanding of how to live in terms of, this is proper, this is not proper. Lama nichteva? What's the point? And he says, to teach you how much reward there is for doing acts of kindness. And that it's a phenomenal statement. And what it says is, close this, just keep it in your head for a second. What it says is that this book is about kindness. That's the thesis, really. That the book is an illustration not necessarily of halacha, but it's a book about the way people behave. And so we can point to a few moments off the top of our heads from the book. We don't have to read the whole book to just remember, but this is a book about the woman Ruth. Ruth is the daughter-in-law of Naomi. These are people who take themselves to there's a famine in the land of Israel. They go to the land of Moab. Naomi and her husband Elimelech. They have two sons, Machlon and Chilion. These two sons, Machlon and Chilion, marry two Moabite women. one of them is named Ruth, and one of them is named Orpah. The two sons die. Elimelech dies, and Naomi comes to the conclusion that she wants to come back to the land of Israel. She tells her daughters-in-law to stay put, don't come back with me, and then they're very weepy, they're very sad about that. But Ruth implores her mother-in-law to say, I want to go with you, and then utters what becomes, I think, the book's most famous line, wherever you go, I will go. Your people are my people, your God is my God. That already is the moment of great truth in this book. And she goes with her, but Orpah stays back, and we don't have a lot of, we don't have critique of her. She makes that decision for her own life. And the moment of kindness is the way that is defined around the way that Ruth conducts herself towards her mother-in-law. In addition, there are other moments of kindness in the book. A moment of kindness when Ruth is gleaning, and she is gleaning in the fields of Boaz and told to be in the primary cohort of gleaners. And then the book's climax where Boaz acts with graciousness and kindness to Ruth, becomes her redeemer, and then in the end marries her, loves her, and she becomes the progenitor of the Davidic kingdom, or David. And so you could see that there is a thread that stitches itself through this book, and the thread is kindness. And that's an easy thing to say about this book. I don't like using the word famous about quotes from the Torah or quotes from the rabbis. I have an Orthodox colleague who says that midrash it's a famous midrash, the famous midrash, right? Famous to only people who read midrash and read this over and over again, or because rabbis constantly preach on it, that make it famous. But what makes it worthy of analysis is that it puts forth a thesis, which is this book is all about kindness. And when you just dip into the surface of the commentary on that midrash, which is a midrash that the book was written to tell you how much there's a reward for kindness, every single commentator says, but wait a minute, there are tons of laws in this book. There are tons of things that we can learn from this book. Namely, we can learn about the laws of Giur, the laws of conversion. We can learn about the laws of levirate marriage. We can learn about laws about gleaning. There are lots and lots of laws here. So we're setting that aside. Rabbi Zera is setting it aside. And that already creates a conversation. So another thing to think about, and it's when you take a class in Midrash at the seminary or a class in Talmud, one of the things that they teach us in reading Talmud or Midrash is to read it critically and to try and figure out who the characters are that are speaking, who are the sages that are named. I have, at my fingertips, just about 3 feet away from where I'm sitting, encyclopedias of the sages, compendia that make possible looking up an index of, which rabbi is who says what, and when a certain rabbi lives, and that kind of enables you to put their statements within a certain context. And just broadly speaking, we know the context of the rabbinic period. There are rabbis like Hillel and Shammai, the early rabbis. There are rabbis Tanaim that Hillel and Shammai are part of that. These are the rabbis of the Mishnah, and then the rabbis of the Gemara, the Amoraim, and then following them there are others. So the Talmud or rabbinic culture is built around the early sages and the later sages, and then there's subdivisions of generations of the Tanaim about 4 or 5 generations of Tanaim, and about 4 or 5, maybe more, generations of Amoraim. And so each one is built on the other, and it's a whole structure. And the world of Talmudic study is based on partly, the relationship of all of these different statements and traditions, and these several hundred individuals whose statements and teachings comprise the rabbinic tradition. Start with Susie. Go ahead. Open your mic.
Yeah, so Rabbi Zera said what he said because he wanted to talk about chesed. But to say Ein Tumah v'Tohara, Ein Heter v'Yisur, he's saying there's nothing legislated there. But which is, you could say that about a lot of things. But if you look at, kind of along with what you said, if you look at the story writ large, it's about a bunch of people of the biblical era who are living the Bible, in that, that you've got the people who the poor people in the fields to come and take the gleanings, and and they the way they address each other, invoking God's name when they say hello to each other, and that's what it's a society that's
organized
sort of,
around.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
entrenched in the Tanakh, in the Chumash.
So I don't. I want to think about how to analyze his statement, and that's where we're going to go in a bit. Because as you speak about it, I think like, okay, so if what would be the analogy? You take I don't know, any American novel. Take Huckleberry Finn, okay, as a very prominent classic American novel, and say, this is not about the Constitution of the United States. This is, although it's situated in a certain time and place where there's slavery and where the Constitution has its limitations, etc. You could, I'm sure someone somewhere did an essay in the graduate class or an undergraduate class arguing, the role of law in Huckleberry Finn or something like that. This is the context in which we are, and certain things are comprehensible in literature because you understand that there are, it's in a society that is governed by, in this case, American law, and that's possible here. But we would never, no court in the land would ever decide a case based on a proof text from Huckleberry Finn, whereas the Talmud cites, I'll give you one example: the Ruth's statement, famous statement, "Your people are my people, your God is my God." The Talmud and later Jewish philosophers will cite that statement as a normative statement for conversion. That is the statement that defines the framework for conversion. That is to say, conversion is about leaping into solidarity with Jewish peoplehood first, and then leaping into solidarity with faith in God. That a Jew, the person who converts to Judaism, is making the decision to link to the destiny of the Jewish people. And that is what Ruth becomes the archetype of. She is the archetype of saying, Amech ami, your people are my people. That's first and foremost. I join the destiny of the Jewish people. I surrender myself, or I accept upon myself the yoke of the God's kingdom. And that is a normative halachic way of understanding conversion. And I mean, I heard, I'm just quoting verbatim when I use those, this statement. I'm quoting things that I heard David Hartman, philosopher, say in his own words. This is what it's about. When Ruth says that, it's peoplehood first and theology second. And that's the normative way that Judaism understands conversion. That's a big statement, and that's a statement that animates plenty of Jewish practice. Okay, but is the Book of Ruth only about conversion? No, it's about something else Is Rabbi Zera saying it's only about kindness? I am not sure about that either. So let's take a little detour, and I want to now experience the AI world with you because this is how I experienced it. But before we do that, Marlene Herman, your question.
Why does he have to say it's not, as opposed to saying this is what I want to look at?
I think
Dismisses the whole.
no. I think there is a there. I, I don't want to kind of cheapen this answer by saying, the rabbis are only interested in halakha, but the rabbis are, you know, interested in halakha as a primary concern, to the extent that sometimes it can negate, or it can marginalize any other concerns, and I think this dynamic plays itself out in Judaism throughout Jewish history. I think it plays itself out now. I mean, and it can play itself out in tragic, circumstances to this day. If you say, halacha is what animates Jewish life, and halacha ought to be the sole determinative criteria for Jewish life, you can collide with basically what we are going to call ethics. I mean, this is, that you can be a completely halachic person and be a menuval, a grotesque person, but you keep Shabbat and you keep kosher, right? And of course halacha tells you to be a nice person, but if your one concern, your sole concern, is following the letter of the law, then you can be, a rather distasteful person in that world. And he's saying, I think, let's understand that what's animating this as a book, and why the book is so cherished, is because at the core it's about goodness and kindness. Ilana, go ahead.
I just want to add a little comment. The book is also about relationship, and we know who and whom.
Yeah, it's a relationships of lots of different things, and again, we could take that as the theme here, a relationship between mothers and daughters-in-law, a relationship between people and their relatives, relationship between husbands and wives, relationship between people on the land, and relationship between people and people. Look, we did study this in previous classes, where we looked at just closely the first lines of Ruth, and saw as they leave, the sense of abandonment, the idea that people leave the land during a difficult time, creates a sense of, we are being abandoned, or worse, the sense that, that Naomi is a traitor. And, I wasn't thinking of that as a topic for today. I just want to mention that that's part of the conversation today in the Jewish people, given that, over half of the Jewish people live in the land of Israel, and the rest of us don't. And in a period of crisis, what is being spoken about and written about, and I don't have the article in front of me. I read this on my most recent trip, and it was radioactive, and said the claim, that we are being abandoned by diaspora Jewry, Israelis speaking this way and writing this way, and writing in a way that's saying, during our most difficult time, we want the presence of diaspora Jewry, and they are abandoning us. Moreover, they are actually working against us. And you could feel the pain, the sting. It's one thing for us, for people to say, like I would say, it's, not everyone can make Aliyah. You can't all go live in Israel, but you can certainly have Israel live inside you, and do as much as you can. That's, a very plausible scenario. But then, when Israelis see, the most recent case of these not rabbinical, these students at the seminary who protested or wrote or whatever it was, that they were objecting to the president coming to deliver a speech at the seminary for their graduation, and he has since said, I have other plans now, I'm not coming. I think it's a terrible, terrible shanda, a disgrace. I'm so embarrassed and so ashamed of this. But the message to Israelis is, you're putting your own kind of identity, of your own particular vision, above the cohesion of the people, and that is just offensive. It's so blatantly, hurtful. So that's one of the core themes here too. And she comes back, Naomi, with Ruth, and they find their way back, and people are accepting of her, and they embrace her. And not only do they embrace her, but to the extent that she becomes, the wife of one of the prominent, persons in Judea. And then, of course, the scroll gives its punchline, which is she becomes the ancestor of David. You can't get much better than that in terms of approval. And so you could say Rab Zera has a point that the book understands that kindness goes a long way. And I think every single one of us would amplify that, and you have different notions in rabbinic culture saying Derech Eretz Kadma Torah, that the calling card for Torah is proper ethical conduct, and which we could define as broadly as possible and say, menschlichkeit, being a mensch, being kind, living kindly, and being gracious and generous, and comporting yourself with all the qualities of goodness and kindness. That is the calling card. That precedes Torah. It's more important, we would say, to be a mensch than to be halachic. And of course, that's where the argument is. Some would say, no, it's more important to be halachic than to be a mensch. I don't know if it would go that far, but it's part of the discussion. Nanette, you have to unmute.
A famine is not the first time
Oh, sorry.
that people leave, they go to another land.
Right. That's right.
The brothers.
The brothers go. That's right. Nanette, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Okay. So, hey, Rabbi, I'm Class. I would never in 100 years ever say this to anybody. But, of course, Rabbi, both my daughter-in-laws have converted. You converted one of them.
Okay.
So, hey, Rabbi, what is it about Jewish people? The world hates us, but yet people convert. I wouldn't convert. I mean, what is it about us that do we have some sort of special powers?
No.
You've seen it all. What do you think?
No, we don't have any special power. What we do have is a story, and it's a compelling story for people who want to have a compelling story and want that sense of belonging, and it's a compelling way of life for people who are looking to find compelling ways of life that have meaning in their lives in the way that Judaism can supply. Look, we know of plenty of people who convert to Christianity, Catholicism, to Islam. People convert to. We live in America where it's a bazaar. Faith and religion are like a buffet, and you shop in the world of all of these things, and you make your decisions and your choices based on what is appealing to you. And while every one of us would say Judaism is very compelling, has a rich history and rich story and a rich way of life, that it means that we would be nothing other than that. For some, it's too much, and there are plenty of people who convert out of Judaism and join other religions for lots and lots of different reasons. John, go ahead. Unmute.
This story seems to go against what appears to be omnipresent in the Torah and the Tanakh, in which the villain is the foreign woman. Foreign women are looked down on. This is what you have to watch out for. And now the foreign woman, the Moabite, becomes the heroine.
Yes. So you actually raised the point that the author of the paper raised, which is that there's a certain subversive quality to this story. This story, one of her thesis points is that this story subverts the Deuteronomy law, which says you're not allowed to marry a Moabite, and literally goes out of its way to prove how important the Moabite woman is, and to prove how central she becomes to the history. I have to say, I mean, based on Rabbi Zera, and I'm going to go to Rabbi Zera first, and then come back to John's point that one of the things that defines the Moabites in the Torah. There are two things that define them. One is the origin of the whole nation of Moab to begin with, and Ammon. These are nations that are not looked on favorably by the Torah, by Israelite culture, because they are the descendants of the incestuous union of Lot and his daughters. If you recall, in the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot is taken out of the town of Sodom, and he hides in a cave with his daughters. They think the world is being destroyed, and the daughters, not knowing if there's going to be any future for humanity, you could argue in their favor that they do a noble thing. They get their father drunk, and they become impregnated by him in order to secure the future for humanity, because they want survival. In a way that you could already tell that the Torah is being not funny but deeply ironic by saying they go to this length of incest, with their father in order to achieve a noble goal. Okay, and so the children born to the two daughters of Lot are Moab and Ammon, which are basically they are the children of an incestuous union that makes them lower than a mamzer, basically. Okay, so that's an unveiled opinion of Ammon and Moab. Now the other unveiled opinion of Moab and Ammon is that when Israel is traversing through the desert, they have to cross through Ammon and Moabite territory, and Moses pleads with them and says, we just let us go along the way. Whatever we drink, we'll pay for. Whatever we eat, we'll pay for. We'll just, please allow us passage. We'll actually pay you a toll. We'll pay you for all the things that we consume, the water especially, and you'll just let us pass through. And the Torah, tells us that Ammon and Moab denied passage to Israel through the desert, which was unkind, a terrible act of unkindness, that would have been compensated. They would have been compensated for it, but they just didn't allow them, and they were cruel. And it also, Balak Melech Moab, Balak is the king of Moab, and he actually, hires Bilam to curse Israel as they are traversing through their territory, and that is just awful. And so the Torah basically, it's not like it's taking off the gloves here and conducting a fight with them. But it's saying, look at these people. They're not only do they're just unkind. They're awful. They're awful people. They do what is so counter to common human culture of desert peoples, which is you help another person in need. That's the etiquette of the desert, and they don't. And so, phooey on them. They can't even join the people of Israel to the 10th generation. Blah 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 blah. It's like there's the stigma on them, and they are pariahs. For us, that's taboo. And here's what happens: they join. and she becomes the mother of David. Go ahead, Susie.
Yeah. So what the Megillah is saying is like kind of the don't judge a book by its cover kind of thing. Don't make assumptions about people.
Certainly about Moab, right?
Yeah.
That one thing for sure. It's also saying that this is what Rabbi Zera is saying is if I were going to subtitle this book is Ruth, a story of kindness, right? Morai Lana.
Um, so Orpah,
Orpah,
the sister of Ruth, was Moavia,
yes.
and the descendant from Orpah is Goliath, who had this incident with David,
With
and
David.
they were second, third cousins for each other, and David killed him.
All right, that's Midrash, right? That's
I don't know
well,
what.
no. Well, because Goliath is a Philistine, right? And the Philistines come from the Mediterranean islands, the Greece, whatever. What's the point?
She married a Philistine. Orpah married.
Okay, so you know, and I'm thinking I have to check that out, but that's a perfect example of it's a redo of another story, which is Amalek is a descendant of Esav, and the conflict between the descendants of Amalek and the descendants of of Jacob plays itself out in the desert as well. So we're just kind of getting an echo of an earlier biblical story. If Goliath is a descendant of Orpah, and that what the rabbis I think are trying to do there is really present conflict, that it's a cultural conflict, that Ruth chooses the culture of generosity, kindness, and Orpah chooses the culture of violence and cruelty. Okay, which is nice polemics, but not in the text. All right, where I went with this is I said, well, who is Rabbi Zera and what does he teach us? And that's my ChatGPT question. And I wrote to my ChatGPT Chavruta. I will just put it up here and share the screen in a second. And it says as follows. And I really enjoy my Chavruta partner on ChatGPT. He says, it's so strange. Rabbi Zera, often pronounced, vocalized Rav Zera in Ashkenaz, is one of the most fascinating transitional figures in the Talmud. Babylonian sage who emigrated to the land of Israel, became the bridge between the two great centers of rabbinic culture. He appears constantly in both Babylonian Talmud and Jerusalem Talmud. His personality emerges with unusual vividness. And here I want to just, historical place. Rav Zera belonged roughly to the third generation of Amorim in Babylonia, and later to the second and third generation of the land of Israel, and on that goes. So the one thing that strikes me that's very interesting about this is that he's a Babylonian. Okay, so I got to kind of imagine the map of the Middle East. I don't have the picture for you, but it's Iraq, Iran, right? He's from there. He's already many generations of Jews. He's living there. He's part of the Babylonian culture, the Babylonian rabbinic culture. And I don't want to put anachronistic terms on him, but he's a Zionist. And that means that he wants to go and live in the land of Israel. And he traverses from Babylonia to Israel, to the land of Israel, and it becomes part of the rabbinic culture in the land of Israel. And what was highlighted in that little paragraph is that there are two distinct rabbinic cultures at this time. By the time of the 3rd or 4th century CE, there's a Babylonian rabbinic culture and a Palestinian or Eretz Israel culture. The Babylonian rabbinic culture goes on, becomes quite authoritative, and that becomes the Babylonian Talmud. And the Eretz Yisrael rabbinic culture goes on to become the Eretz Yisrael Talmud. And they have distinctive characteristics. The Babylonians are more given to a kind of question-answer and also, dialectics. The Palestinian Eretz Yisrael culture is more direct and imaginative. And this individual, Rabbi Zera, migrates from the outside land of Israel territory to the Eretz Yisrael, to the Israel territory, which means, and I'm only thinking about this now, it should have occurred to me like, the V8 commercial said, I could have had a V8, duh. It's just like, what it occurs to me, of course he would identify with Ruth. Of course he would identify with these characters and the book, because the book is about migration. And here's a person who lives this. I want to say, just in general, on the idea of rabbinic cultures, that emerge in different localities. Look at, we could look at two examples of that from the last 100 years. You had a European rabbinic culture, and you had American rabbinic culture, or even in Europe, you had Western European and Eastern European, and the Western European cultures, Germany, France, England, were much more inclined towards enlightenment than the Eastern European, the Polish Lithuanians, who were less so inclined, although there were pockets of those cultures within Eastern Europe. They're always interesting to discover. The Enlightenment made it to Eastern Europe, and it's so interesting to find examples. There were Reform synagogues even in Krakow. There were groups of people. There was the Tarbut school movement that, certainly Zionism brought a lot of that to Eastern Europe. But we have a certain association with that rabbinic culture and that Jewish culture, as opposed to German Jewish culture. And then forget that. The Holocaust destroyed all of that. We have American Jewish culture and now Israeli Jewish culture, American rabbinic culture and Israeli rabbinic culture, and there really are two different cultures. They're two different. They speak in two different languages. They live in two different worlds. They are engaged in two different sets of questions, and they argue and conduct themselves really in completely different ways. And it's not that I want to identify with Rabbi Zera here, because I certainly don't live in the land of Israel. I'm conversant enough, on the surface with Israeli rabbinic culture and Israeli rabbinic discourse. I listen to it, I read it, I study it. I'm an audience member of the people that are. I'm looking at my desk now, and half the books I have on my desk now that are accessible to me are written by Israelis. It's just a fact. That's where I'm getting the stream of information, to prepare for classes and to think. And the other half are written by Americans, So I'm living in between both of those worlds, where I have, here's this book. This is just a book I picked up last time, Michal Tukachinsky. She's an Israeli writer. Here's another book. This book, Yaakov Bazak, another Israeli writer. And Adina Sussman. She's an American. She's a cookbook writer. But here, no, this is the JPS commentary. This is English. This is Rabbi Milgram or Professor Milgram and Robert Alter, et cetera, et cetera. What I'm saying is that as narrow a world as this is, it's actually a big world, and that I am thinking that Rabbi Zera is living in the Babylonian world, and he's living in the quote-unquote, anachronistically saying, Israeli world. He's living in Israel, and he's living in Babylonia, and he moves from Babylonia to Israel, and therefore he understands this, and where he's inclined, he's inclined to the characterization of Judaism in terms of ethics and humility. Let's read a little bit more from what the ChatGPT said about him, because I think it's really fascinating both to read that on the surface and to see this as a kind of, ChatGPT did this whole essay for me in literally half a second. Okay, so he gives between two worlds, the Babylonia, the dialectical, analytical. The land of Israel is concise, intuitive, argument-driven versus tradition-driven, expansive discussion, sharper formulations. Rabbi Zera becomes the literary embodiment of the encounter between those worlds. At the same time, he never completely abandons his Babylonian roots. He frequently mediates between the traditions, etc. But his character, self-effacing, patient, hesitant to humiliate others, morally refined, self-disciplined, ascetic, gentle. He is cautious about embarrassing others, burdening communities, harsh religious behaviors. His halachic style, he always presses what is exactly the case, what practical difference results, how do the categories relate. I don't want to make too much of a thing of it of this, but if any of you, I'll stop here just because I'm getting a kick out of this. If any of you watch my Parsha talks with Rabbi Chesler and Kalmanovsky, so you see, what's so interesting is that we all love each other, we're good friends, and we all have three different tendencies, okay? And you could see, Rabbi Kalmanovsky is much more inclined to certain kinds of commentators and certain kinds of, the mysticism. And Rabbi Chesler is more inclined to kind of literary and other things. And I'm always asking, what's the story? We animate our discussions based on, things that we gravitate to, and that ought not to surprise us, because you put two people in a room and you talk about a test, and they're going to, eventually talk about the things that are important to them, that animate their whole way of looking at the world, and why would it surprise us that here in authority, Rabbi Zera would animate the world? It would be the same thing as saying, I don't want to, this is so it's an exaggeration, but we at JTS, we grew up with the stories of Mordechai Kaplan and Abraham Joshua Heschel. So, these two towering figures were on the faculty of the seminary, and they had two completely different orientations towards the whole tradition. Mordechai Kaplan, super rationalist, super logic, super, modern, and Heschel, basically, I don't want to say nostalgic, but the spiritual, the ascetic, the mystical, and you put those two worlds together, and you have some very interesting conversations, and that dialectic is going on. So here, Rabbi Zera embodies this, but he leans towards the more imaginative and the more the ethical part of the tradition. Let me just put up again what he says. Okay, so here we go. He is rarely an extremist. His halakhic discourse, he often narrows radical positions, seeks workable interpretations, agotic and spiritual tendencies, deep awareness of frailty, etc., longing for spiritual refinement, the sanctity of the land of memorable narratives. He has all sorts of different kinds of stories that are associated with him. Then I asked, in Ruth Rabbah, it states, I see, Bob, your hand up for a second. Rabbi Zera said, the scroll does not contain the laws of purity and impurity, etc., the quote that we had. It is to teach you the extent of the good reward for those who perform kindness. And yet, commentators are quick to pounce, this is me writing, on the fact that Ruth contains many different sources of laws. Out of curiosity and with a critical posture, how would you characterize Rabbi Zera's statement in Ruth Rabbah in light of his biography? Is he trying to say something deeper here than it's a nice book? Yes, says ChatGPT. In light of Rabbi Zera's biography, his statement in Ruth Rabbah is far more radical and programmatic than it first appears. Ruth is not about law, it's about kindness. But I do not think Rav Zera means Ruth is merely edifying literature. Quite the opposite. He is making a claim about what the Torah fundamentally is. First, the obvious tension. The irony is glaring. The rabbis themselves mine the book for conversion, customs, poor, etc. So Rabbi Zera knew perfectly well that Ruth had halachic implications. The statement is not informational, it's interpretive and ideological. He is telling you how to read the book. What is he negating? The scroll does not contain purity. Impurity, permission, no. He says, if you approach Ruth looking primarily for legal taxonomy, you have missed its center. That's very characteristic. What's the core? The core is not legal taxonomy, the core is kindness. It's a critique of legalism. Remember, he leaves Babylonia. He fasts away. He wants to purge himself of that worldview. It would be like making Aliyah today and saying, I'm going to not speak English anymore. I'm going to speak only in Hebrew. I'm going to purge myself of the seminary, Heschel, Kaplan, all that stuff. I'm just going to go and immerse myself in Hebrew and the Hebrew University and all the scholars of Bible at Bar Ilan University, okay? And he never rejects halakha. He's fully rabbinic. And so when he says Ruth is not fundamentally about Isur v'Heter law, he means, I suspect ChatGPT is saying, Torah cannot be reduced to juridical classification. That's a much stronger statement than it's a nice story. It's, in other words, you can't just make it into a nice story, and you can't say it's not. It's about law. So the key phrase is "Lilamedcha kama sachar tov legomlei chasadim," usually translated to teach the reward of those who perform kindness. But chesed in Ruth is not random niceness. In Ruth exceeds obligation. Boaz exceeds obligation. Naomi acts within networks of loyalty and vulnerability. The legal structures exist, but the story turns on what people do beyond minimal obligation. That distinction matters enormously. The scroll constantly stages the relationship between formal law, moral generosity. For example, gleaning laws to protect the poor. Boaz conduct goes far beyond compliance. Rab Zera may be suggesting the deepest purpose of Torah law is revealed only when transformed into chesed. In that sense, Ruth becomes a critique of minimalist legal obedience. And I'll close there and say it's a critique of doing only things to the letter of the law. What the book is about then is a subversion. It's a subversion in the case of the Ammonite, and the writer that I spoke to deals with it at length. But it's a subversion of law, and it tells you that you actually you subvert the law by going above and beyond the law. The law doesn't demand of you to do what Ruth does for Naomi. The law basically said Ruth was, I don't want to, dispute what Ilana said about Orpah before, but it does, it's perfectly fine. It was perfectly fine for Orpah to go back to her normal place. I mean, what would you do? What would a normal person do under the circumstances? And what would a mother-in-law, and we all identify with. I mean, I can't tell you how many stories of people who they experience tragedy in their life and they feel terribly guilty for enjoying their life after a tragedy, right? And I say to them, God bless you. You go on with your life. You don't, you suffered and all that, and we understand it. But, I quote Tevye Muttel the tailor, even Muttel the tailor is entitled to a little happiness, okay? So a person, you can experience your life again. You don't need to live in complete sorrow after tragedy. You're young, to a younger person who has had a terrible loss and wants to live in that kind of, feels guilty about enjoying life after a terrible loss. And I say, go live your life. It's totally acceptable. Not only that, you should. But so, you have Naomi and Ruth saying, I'm going to go beyond the obligations that are necessary. I don't want to necessarily have a life that you can construe as selfish. Ruth is saying, I want to be with you. I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to attend to you. And of course that's accorded with status of being above and beyond. Bob, I'm going to turn to you. Go ahead.
I wanted to come back to how you started the class off, which was AI as a Chavruta partner.
Yes, thank you.
And I wanted to react to some of what you put up there because I have serious concerns and critiques. And I'm
Good.
not an AI user much or an expert on it. But I will say that I've seen a growing number of articles about AI hallucinations,
Okay.
and particularly in journals where scientists have published things and they've asked questions to AI, and AI has actually generated false references, false information. And so I'm a little nervous about having a single AI as a Chavruta partner. But if you asked your same questions to Claude or Perplexity or ChatGPT or all the different varieties, I'm curious if the answers would be similar or different. That's point number one.
Good. Thank you.
Point number two is that they're finding that people tend to, the AI sometimes reflects back to support the person's questions and thesis. And so it would
100%.
be interesting if you put in contrary views about Ruth to this, what your chat GPT would generate. So I'm just curious, how do you sort out the different AIs that are out there as like different rabbis and different teachers?
Sure. So I've been tending to use one only out of habit and because I just don't want to pay for one or more of them. I just don't, I'm still a novice user of this, and I am aware very much of both those points, which is one that they need to be cross-checked rigorously, um, and I have encountered this more than once with AI that I have gotten a wrong answer when I've gone back to a source, or I will be working on a sermon or a class or a sheet, a Parsha sheet, and I'll ask a question that's a reference question, and I'll write back and say, you know, are you saying this or is the source saying this? And then it will say, oh, it'll kind of wink and say, well, you caught me again. This is not what the source said. This is my reiteration of the source. And I will, kind of push back and say, I want to, if you're citing this book, where in the book would I find an idea that is, that is closely related to what you said? And how did you get from the book to this statement? They'll create a pithy, quotable statement, but it's not found in the source. And so you have to be very, very careful. And so, that's number one. Number two is yeah, they tend to be very flattering to you. Okay, it's very nice and I it you could be sucked into this and literally into you're thinking that you're brilliant and yet they tell you that, oh, what a great insight it is and all that, and I have to read it with a large lump of salt, and here's where I would push back on myself, which is, I would say the warning, the caveat for a person like me is use it as a tool, use it as an encyclopedia, use it as a reference, use it as the kind of sounding board, but don't get lazy. And I can see myself, okay, and I'm making fun of myself now, and I'm going to say this because this is like a confession. The encyclopedia of the sages is literally here's my hand. It's on the shelf next to my hand. All I need to do is get up out of my chair and go to the library and pull out the book. But I stayed in my chair. And that's lazy. And that means, A, I don't have 3 hours to go through the article on Rabbi Zera, and I need it immediately. And I'm sacrificing the depth of the exposure to the written source in a book that was written by a human being, a learned human being who I trust and value, to this automated respondent who has churned through all the data and given me what admittedly could be very questionable answer. And I have to be constantly careful about that. And it is just so easy. And that's where I am. I'm in between I don't have 3 hours to go do the cross-referencing of everything he said, to but beware, Elliot Malamet, don't ever present this as your own idea and treat it with the caution that it deserves to be treated with. Use it. There are certain things that are valuable here. I've learned a lot from it, and if in fact this is accurate, an accurate depiction of this character, Rabbi Zera, then there's something very valuable here. But before I even write a word about this and publish it under my own name, I don't want to use any vernacular here but strong language. I better damn do my own work, okay? And what I resent is, and I see this already in certain places where people are presenting their own work as their own when it's clear that it was AI driven. I'll give you one example where I saw this. A person wrote an article and I ran it through the AI checker, and 90% of it came back generated by AI. I'm very proud of the fact that if you put any of my single Parsha sheets through the AI checker, it says 99% of it is authentic to you, and 1% is online. And the 1% that's online are the quotes from the Torah that are in online sources that I'm using. Okay, so way to go, me. Okay.
I have to give you another warning, though, that they took a scientist or sociologist, published a paper back in the 70s or 80s, way before AI was there, and they put his paper through AI, and the same accusation was made that 80 to 90% of it was generated by AI. So even the AI checkers have their problems.
All right. Well, here's what I want to say to that is that I know the person that purported to write the article, and I put the article through the thing, and I said to myself, there is no way, I'll leave blank the expletives, that this person could have written this in the time allotment that was required for this. There's no way that this person has the breadth of knowledge necessary, and that this is completely artificial. I'll give you one other example of this, which is, and I think I mentioned it, which is I asked AI a halachic query, and what I got was a very rigorous and thorough halachic answer. And someone, in the congregation had a query and said, look, I tested this out on AI, and this was the response. And I read the response, and it was quite thorough, quite rigorous. And my reaction was nausea. I have a certain nausea about this because it says, like, okay, so what does this mean now? That you can get all of these answers generated, and it just means that the obligation to engage authentically is that much more important. However, and I want to say that look, there's what to say for what it can do, and what it does for me is it creates the possibility of going down certain avenues and answering questions. I'm going to come out with a plus on it and to say I've gained a lot in terms of the kind of responses that I've gotten from it, because it's generated in me the desire to really dig deeper and to engage with the sources in a different way, and I have to realize that the new challenge in this world of study is the challenge against apathy and laziness. And that's a challenge that's a very, very old challenge for a lot of students. Okay, I mean, we all were students, and it was much easier to it's always going to be easier to do someone else's work. Okay. Go ahead, Susie.
So along the same lines, there was somebody, I don't remember where I read this, but somebody wrote into Chat GPT once upon a time and asked and got an answer. It's something like, why do we eat hamantashen on Rosh Hashanah?
Yeah.
And then got an answer as to why one would eat hamantashen on Rosh Hashanah.
Yeah.
I was doing research on my converso of interest, and I couldn't remember where I had read on the internet, but it was a source on the internet where he was baptized, and I couldn't remember, and I couldn't find it again. So I asked ChatGPT, and I got what I knew was the wrong answer.
I want to just end with the punchline of the article. So she goes through the whole discussion of uh, you know how the book is Ruth is subversive, and she writes as follows at the end. She goes through the different arguments. Boaz chooses to interpret Ruth's request in the most inclusive and far-reaching sense. Ruth, that is to say, she wants to be connected to him. He does not have to. He doesn't have to. That is, redemption is not levirate marriage. As a Boaz is the redeemer to Ruth. He's not obliged to marry Ruth, but only to find ways to take care of her. This is what the Goel is expected to do for Naomi. Yet Boaz goes well beyond any call of duty. He makes chesed his hermeneutical key for how to carry out Ruth's ambiguous request. His choice offers another key for understanding why we read the Ruth of Shavuot. On the day we receive the Torah again and are faced with inevitable Torah ambiguities, is the book of Ruth not teaching us the value of choosing chesed when turning unchangeable laws into life? And again, that last line is the line that needs to kind of be meditated on with a sip of wine, which is that we get the Torah again on Shavuot. That's what we celebrate. And we're faced with ambiguities. The Torah is filled with lots of ambiguities. So the book of Ruth is teaching us, choose chesed when you are looking at unchangeable laws. In other words, you are always going to be in this dynamic or dialectic between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law, or the letter of the law and beyond the law, or what we could call, and here I think everyone will appreciate it, being frum or being a mensch. And you know what? To be a mensch actually makes being frum more valuable. If the best thing to be is a mensch, you could be a mensch without being so frum, okay? But you can't be frum without being a mensch. That's the point. Bob Like, Marlene Herman, 2 last points. Go ahead.
Yeah, I really like that last comment because one of my takeaways from reading Ruth at the time of Shavuos and also Nasu is that the revelation is not just about the laws, but also the revelation are these other factors of chesed, of avoiding arrogance, of cultivating humility, and all of that as one enacts that. So is that a possible other corrective, that it's not just about halakha, but revelation is all this other stuff too?
Absolutely, 100%. It is. We tend to forget that because, and I'd like to include myself in the people that want to read it narrowly, but I know I don't, but I know it's tempting too. And we have to read it much more expansively. Revelation is much more than just the law. Marlene, good.
All that, and when you choose AI as your chavruta, it doesn't ask you questions back. When you have a live partner, you have a give and take along with all the research.
Absolutely.
And also, he was a man and she was a woman and she was good looking, and sex in the Bible.
Well, so that is also part. It's hard to read the book of Ruth.
We wouldn't have David.
It's hard to read. It's hard to read the book of Ruth. And here I should probably stop the recording because I'm going to say something a little naughty. But when Naomi says, "Take the blanket off him and sleep next to his margalotav," okay, margalotav. So all of the pretty translations say his toes. Yeah. Take the blanket off of his toes. And I remember, and I'm going to quote Barry Levy, a professor of Bible at McGill University, who said, I don't think so. I think Margalotav refers to another part of the anatomy. And so I can't read this without thinking that, in fact, she makes him really cold by taking the blanket off of his whole body, okay, and exposing his margaliot, okay, and And then when he wakes up and sees that she's, a fairly attractive woman is sleeping next to her, I it's hard not to read that as any male would read that and say, yeah, well, what a great opportunity this is, and he covers her, and it's actually a beautiful moment. The beautiful moment is the moment of warmth that he is embracing a woman next to him who is coming literally under the wings of his protection. I was going to show a scene from the movie. I forget about the partisans in the desert. What was the I forget what it was called. Okay, so where they match up. They're partisans in the forest, and she says, "I want protection. I want to be protected," and so she becomes his mate, the leader of the partisan unit. It's a beautiful scene. I didn't have the time to go look for it, but the idea that I am a woman vulnerable and I need the man's protection, and that's the symbol there. And of course, it's a gendered reading of it. That's all that, but it's also life. Very good. All right, with that, we're going to conclude. Have a beautiful week and a beautiful Shavuot. We will